Hey, it's Vanessa, the Crafty Gemini. If you're a new viewer, welcome to my channel. And if you are a returning viewer, you probably already caught my last video where I shared with you 3 tips on how to choose the best interfacing or stabilizer for your bag projects. Now in this video, I'm going to be sharing some more tips with you, but I also wanted to give you more information on my new online bag club mini edition. This is going to be the second time that we do one of my online bag clubs featuring smaller mini projects. Now this will be the 10th overall club that we've hosted over the past 6 years. We've had over 6,000 students register for our clubs and online courses in that amount of time, and I'm sure that this next one, you're going to love the projects. I think personally that they're even better than the last mini edition that we finished up earlier this year. Now in this upcoming club, if you're not aware, my clubs feature a number of different projects where I teach you how to make each one with step-by-step video lessons. Each project also comes with downloadable and printable PDF instructions that are great to supplement for you to take notes as you watch the video lessons and work your way through the projects. They also come in really handy to just print out and store away in a folder somewhere. So if you've watched the videos but you just need a quick little refresher 3 or 6 months down the line to make the project again, you can pull out the PDF and check out your notes, and that will easily also walk you through the projects. Now, one great thing about all my online courses and membership clubs is that your access to the content never expires. So if you sign up for one of my clubs today, because you can still access some of the older clubs that we have already released, if you sign up for one of them today, let's say, 2 years from now, you can log back into your account and all the content will be there. So obviously the same thing is going to apply with this next club that we are getting ready to open up. But for now, I want to share with you 2 tips. These are 2 actionable items that you can do today in whatever sewing project you're working on to help elevate your sewing skills. So tip number 1 of what you can do right now is to shorten your stitch length in a construction seam. And that's just a terminology that I like to use, construction seam. So if you think about construction of a home, if the foundation of a new home that's being built is not solid, if it's not done correctly, the house is going to fall apart over time, right? So when we think about our seams that we use to connect 2 pieces of fabric as we create a 3-dimensional project like a bag or a pouch, if the construction seam is not short and tight and it's really doing its job of holding the fabric layers together, that bag is going to fall apart quicker than if you shortened your stitch length. Now, when you turn on and off your sewing machine, if it's computerized, you will have a different default setting here. You can see that I just reset mine, turned it back on, and the default stitch length is 2.2. Now this means 2.2 millimeters. It's in metric system. So you'll need to check what yours is and what the equivalent is if it doesn't have a same decimal kind of like mine. This is my rule of thumb and what I recommend to my students. On a construction seam, you should be between 2 millimeters and 2.5 at the most, okay? So let's go ahead and try this out with the shortest in that range I just gave you, 2 millimeters. So if you do 2 millimeters, and I'm just going to do a straight stitch, I folded up my fabric. You always, when you're testing out and playing with your settings, make sure that you're doing it through 2 layers of fabric so you can get a truer representation of what it will look like in the project, because you're going to be sewing 2 layers of something together or more, right? So this is a 2 millimeter stitch length. It's tiny, right? It's been a while. I don't change the needle on this machine, so I probably need to do that too. But see what happens here? When you tug on the seam, it holds together really, really well. Okay, I really have to pull on it in order to see those black stitches because I'm using black thread, okay? So now let's go ahead and try with 2.5. Now if I change that setting to 2.5, notice my machine doesn't allow me to go to 2.5. Some machines will increment by 0.1. This one obviously does by 0.2 because it's all even numbers. So let's go to 2.6 just to try it out so you can be in that similar range. It's a little tricky to see, but I think you can kind of see that these stitches are longer. Where the needle went in and out of the fabric, there's more space in between it than this one. So 2 things to note about these. The shorter stitch length, which is the top line, is going to hold together the fabric a lot more. It's also going to make it stiffer because you have more thread in the same distance because there's more stitches along that seam, okay? So this one is a little bit more stretched out. It's still going to do a decent job, but if it's an area in a project that really, really needs to be held together and cannot come apart or stretch or break easily, then the shorter the stitch length you want to go, okay? I think you see where I'm going with this, that if we went longer in the stitch length, it's going to be weaker and weaker and weaker, okay? So let's try a really long one so you can really see the difference. So now let's go however long this machine will let me go. Again, different machines will have different settings. Mine allows me to go, you hear that beeping, no longer than 5 millimeter stitch length. Higher end machines will allow you to go 6 and 7 millimeters in stitch length. But I just want to show you the difference between 2 millimeter stitch length on the first line we did and now this last one at 5 millimeters. It's lighter, has less thread in the same distance, and the stitches are a lot longer. So you can see here where the needle went in and out of the project. I can get the entire tip of this knitting needle under there because the stitch is that long. So what does that also tell you? That if this is going to be a seam in a project that's going to have little kids' fingers, toes, it's going to get a lot of wear and tear, things are going to be clipping this and grabbing onto it because the stitch is so long, again, it will not last you as long as a stitch that was shorter. See, I can't even grab this. Plus, there's more thread, there's more stitches. So overall, the shorter stitch length is going to be a lot stronger than a longer one. This is what we would call a basting stitch, okay? And you can see, if I wanted to, I could just come in here and pull that whole thing out. You see that? I literally just lifted the thread and the entire seam came out. So this is something that's very important because oftentimes no one tells you this. And you likely won't see it on a pattern, them telling you, hey, keep the seam allowance at 2 millimeters. For this seam, use a 2.4. For this seam, don't go any bigger than 3 or whatever. But these are some of the things that I like to tell my students so that they can, one, familiarize themselves with their sewing machine and the settings. You shouldn't be afraid to really play with the buttons and adjust the settings because that is going to help you get better results in your finished projects. The more you understand how to use the different features of your sewing machine, the better results you'll have because you can customize every seam to make it be as strong or as easily to pull out, right? As weak as you need it to be based on your needs, all right? So that is tip number 1. If it is a construction stitch, meaning it's a place in the project that you absolutely want to be held together nicely through wear and tear and yanking and stretching to put it on or whatever, shorten the stitch length. Now, tip number 2 is going to be lengthen that stitch length if it is for top stitching a seam. Now, top stitching is any type of stitching that you see on the outside, that you see in the finished project. In other words, it's not a stitch that's holding two pieces together because that's going to help keep the integrity of the project, right? Where I sewed this front of this credit card pocket to the back main fabric, this side seam here was a construction seam, right? This is what's holding the shape of the pouch. But if we contrast that with the stitching that's done right here along the top of the flap, this is top stitching because it's not a construction seam, meaning I could have left this stitching off and it wouldn't have affected the finished shape of the project. It just helps keep the layers together. So if you do wash it, it's not going to be separating on you. And it also allows you just kind of another area to add a pop of color or add a few more decorative stitches. In this case, it's just a basic gray thread, but it does give it a nicer, more clean and finished look, okay? Notice here where you see the stitches, they are a little bit longer than those tiny, tiny short ones that we use and that I recommended in a construction stitch. For top stitching, you want to lengthen it for a few different reasons. One, personally, I like the way a slightly longer stitch looks because it gives you, or it allows you to see some really good stitch definition, especially if you use a different thread or contrasting thread color. Even variegated threads look really great for top stitching. But also, usually when we're top stitching, we're going through multiple layers of interfaced fabrics, okay? And so you usually need to lengthen your stitch length if you're going over bulk. So that's another tip there, just keep that in mind. The more layers of fabric you're going through, the more you're gonna wanna tweak that length of your stitch higher and higher, right? Longer and longer to accommodate for all the bulky layers of the project going through the sewing machine presser foot. Now, this is a little pouch that we're going to feature in the new bag club, but that's just a sneak peek. Now let's talk about the top stitching. So here I have just a sample piece of fabric, and if I fold this top edge under towards the wrong side, this is often a little technique that you'll see on patch pockets and some patterns. I folded it back, and now I'm going to take this raw edge and I'm going to fold it in and fold it back down. This is a quick way to do a simple hem, and what this is going to do, it conceals the raw edge of the fabric. So if I fold it back onto itself, you see that now I have a finished, so imagine that was like a little pocket. You could do that if these side seams were going to be inserted in another seam, whatever it may be, but I'm just giving you an idea. If we top stitch the top like this to prep a pocket, and then the instructions tell you to top stitch, you don't want to top stitch with a teensy little short stitch like 2 or 2.5 millimeters. Oftentimes, I will recommend my students use 3 to 3.5 in that range. Now, you can go up from there if you're top stitching through a lot more layers, and you can go down from there if you're top stitching maybe some really, really thin fabric and it's just turned under once, let's say. Here, I'm going to be stitching through 1, 2, 3 layers of fabric, okay? So I've already added additional bulk from just one little rectangle that I had, and I'm going to put it at my suggested stitch length of 3 millimeters. Anywhere from 3 to 3.5 is usually a good place to start. And then I just stitch across. Now I'm using black thread so y'all can see that a little bit better, but the stitches are a little bit longer, but it's still fed through the sewing machine super easily because although we tripled up the fabric thickness, because we added a little bit of length to what normally would be a construction stitch, I was able to stitch right through it nice and easily using a 3 millimeter stitch, okay? When you lengthen the top stitch, remember, you are sewing still through the layers, but this seam here is just to hold that little hem underneath. It's not going to hold weight in the bag, really. It's not going to affect the shape of the bag. If I put something heavy inside of it, it's not going to fall apart because this top stitching isn't short. So keep those things in mind. What the purpose of the seam is will help you determine how short or how long to make it. All right, so there you have it. 2 super simple changes that you can make today to elevate your sewing skills. Now, something as basic as adjusting the stitch length like I just showed you can really take your projects to the next level, but as beginners, nobody really is stopping to break that down for you, and you probably have never seen those type of tips and tricks in a sewing pattern. Now, as an instructor, I have been teaching students in person and online for over 15 years on how to do all kinds of things. So I tend to kind of lean into different little ways that I explain things, different cues that I like to give, especially my beginner students. So if you are still confused, maybe by the terminology, or maybe you're a beginner into bag making and have no idea because it's so overwhelming, the number of products and tools, and it's so much information, then you might want to stick around because my teaching style really lends itself to those beginners. So I'll give you a quick example. Early on in my teaching years, I want to say this was maybe 13, 14 years ago or so, when I was teaching classes to local students through community education at a local college, I started to notice that a lot of my beginner students, both in sewing and in quilting classes, were getting confused when we would say the right side of the fabric, because since you're manipulating the fabric with your right or left hands, they kept kind of mixing up the terminology as in right in directional right and right as in correct right. And so way back in those days, once I started catching on to that they were getting confused, I quickly came up with pretty sides touching. And it's funny because a lot of more intermediate and advanced sewists write me all the time and tell me how much they hate hearing me say pretty sides touching. And I also have a massive amount of beginners who say, thank you, it finally clicked for me because you said pretty sides touching. And what I mean by that is just when we sew a seam so that it turns out correctly, we're sewing the 2 pretty sides of a fabric together. Okay, so those type of things, if you really need an instructor with that type of a teaching style who makes everything more simplified and really is providing some hand holding and guidance for these instructional video courses, you might want to keep watching because in the next video, I am going to show you the 5 projects that we will be making together in the 10th edition of the Crafty Gemini Bag Club, which is going to feature 5 adorable, if I do say so myself, mini bag projects. Now, if you enjoyed this video and you learned something, definitely give it a thumbs up and consider clicking the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of my future videos, especially the next one, because I'm going to reveal to you all the projects that we'll be making. I'll go over the price, how long that registration window will be open for, what all you will be getting, when it begins, and all those details for those of you who are ready to jump in and learn how to make 5 new bag projects with me this year. Thanks again for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.